This is a fantastic lens. It's the Canon EF 85mm f1.8. I've been buying Canon lenses since the early 80s, and this is one of the few lenses that has exceeded my expectations. In this video, I'll be explaining why, I'll be describing how I use it, and I'll be showing you some sample images. But firstly, let's take a bit of a closer look at the lens. It's fairly light and compact. It only weighs 425 grams or 15 ounces. The length is 71.5 millimeters. The maximum diameter is 75 millimeters, and the filter size is 58 millimeters. The closest focusing distance is 0.85 meters or 2.8 feet. It has a minimum aperture of f22 and a big maximum aperture of f1.8, which I'll be talking about a bit later. Inside there are 8 diaphragm blades and 9 lens elements in 7 groups. The autofocus uses a ring type ultrasonic motor. A soft case is available, which I don't have, and a lens hood is available, which I do have. This is the ET65-3. However, I don't use it very much. I find that when I do use it, I don't really see much of an improvement in image quality, and when I don't use it, I don't have any problems, so it tends to stay in the bag most of the time. Price-wise, in the US, it's about $350, but the US is probably the cheapest country to buy camera equipment. In most other countries, it's going to be more expensive. In the UK, for example, it will cost you something between £350 and £400. Lenses with big maximum apertures have some nice advantages. You get a nice bright image in your viewfinder. In low light conditions, you don't need to use very high ISOs or very slow shutter speeds. And because of the very narrow depth of field, it's very easy to isolate your subject. The 3 cats in the photo are staggered, but because I'm using a very small aperture, they're all in focus, and you can also see quite a lot of detail in the background. As I start to open up the aperture, what you see is that the cats either side and the background start to go out of focus. As I continue opening up the aperture, this effect continues to become more exaggerated. In the final photo, I've opened up the lens to its maximum aperture of f1.8, and you can clearly see that the cat in the middle is in focus, the cats either side are out of focus, and the background is completely out of focus. This effect is known as bokeh, and bokeh quality varies quite a lot between lenses. With some lenses it looks quite unattractive, but as you can see with this particular lens, it looks very good. It's smooth and creamy, and it makes a perfect background for portraits. This lens is regarded by many as being primarily a portrait lens, and you can see why. The subject is clear and sharp, and the background bokeh is very attractive. So it has all the right qualities to make a perfect portrait lens. Here are a few portraits I've taken with this lens, using both my old 40D DSLR and the EOS M6 that I use currently. Obviously, when using mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras with this lens, you need to use an appropriate adapter. But thinking about this lens purely as a portrait lens does it a great disservice, because it's much more flexible than that. I find it a great lens for street photography. Generally, I prefer wide-angle lenses for street photography, but they're not always ideal. Sometimes you can't physically get close enough to your subjects with a wide-angle lens, so you need a lens that's a bit longer. At other times, you just want to get in closer to get more detail. And if you're taking candid portraits, you want to keep at a discreet distance, so you need a longer lens. With street photography, you want to remain as inconspicuous as possible, and that's not going to happen with a huge white lens attached to your camera. But because the 85mm f1.8 is very small and light, you don't draw attention to yourself. It's probably not the best primary lens for street photography, but as a secondary lens, I find it ideal. But that's not all. I've also found the 85mm f1.8 to be a great macro lens. but not by itself, because the closest focusing distance of 0.85 meters is too far. What you need to do is to use one or more of these. These are extension tubes, and what they do is to reduce the closest focusing distance so you can get in closer to your subject. These ones are made by Canon and they're quite expensive, but there are lots of cheap versions available, and you don't need to worry too much because there's no optical element inside. All they are is a physical mount. These go between the lens and the camera, and there are some electrical contacts to carry the signal from the camera body to the lens. Extension tubes work better with some lenses than others, and they work particularly well with the EF 85mm f1.8. Unlike teleconverters, there are no internal optics. They give you extra magnification by allowing you to focus closer to your subject. This lens normally has a closest focusing distance of 0.85 of a metre. But when I put on 37mm worth of extension tubes, I can now focus to approximately 0.35 of a metre, which is half a metre closer. The focusing range is quite narrow and it can be a bit tricky to set up, but buying a few cheap extension tubes provides a cheap and convenient way to get into macro photography. If you want, you can buy an expensive macro lens, or alternatively, just buy an EF 85mm 1.8 and a couple of cheap extension tubes. That way you'll have a great lens for portraits, for street photography, for product photography, and using these you'll also have a great lens for macro. The results won't be quite as good as using a specialised macro lens, but I've taken plenty of macro shots using this combination and the results are more than satisfactory, and it's a lot cheaper than buying a specialised macro lens. The EF 85mm f1.8 is very sharp, and by using extension tubes to reduce the minimum focusing distance, you can get some very pleasing macro shots. After giving this lens so much praise, are there any problems? It's not perfect, and for the amount it sells for, you wouldn't expect it to be perfect. One possible problem for some people is the lack of image stabilisation. You could say that it's a fast lens and IS isn't necessary, but once you get used to using IS, you do miss it on non-IS lenses. Personally, I don't find the lack of IS on this particular lens to be a real problem. In the past, I've read forum comments about chromatic aberration with this lens, but I've never experienced any problems myself. On one occasion, I went through every image I'd taken with this lens looking for any chromatic aberration, and on a very small number of images I found a little bit of purple fringing. It was only at aperture f1.8 and I had to zoom in 100% and pixel peak before I saw it. It's the same with anything. If your intention is to find a problem with any lens, you will find a problem. But if you just use the lens in a normal way, I don't think you'll notice any problem at all. Finally, would I recommend buying this lens? And to answer that question, what I normally do is to ask myself, if a lens was lost or stolen, would I go out and buy the same lens again? And with some lenses, that's quite an easy question to answer. But with this one, it's quite difficult because a lot of things have changed since I bought it. One thing that's changed is that Canon released another 85mm lens a few years ago. It's f1.4, so it gives you another stop. It's latest design, it's got all the latest lens coatings, and it's got image stabilisation, so it gives you 4 stops of IS. It's a lens that I would love, but it's 4 times more expensive than this one. And the other thing that's changed, for reasons I won't go into now, is that my financial situation has got a lot worse since I bought this lens. Whereas I used to just be able to go out and buy lenses if I wanted to, that's no longer the case. So my recommendation is, if money's not an object, if you're not on a budget, go out and buy a better lens. If you are on a bit of a budget, or things are a bit tight, as they are for me at the moment, then this is a great lens. Just because a new lens was released, it doesn't instantly make this lens a bad lens. It's still very, very good. And as I showed in the video, it's very flexible and it can be used for many different things. So yes, it is a lens that I would still recommend. I hope this has been useful. I do have plans to review the rest of my camera equipment, and I'm hoping to put out at least one video a week. If this has been useful, and to make sure you don't miss future videos, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.